we're in these unique scenarios, and the last thing you want to do is trying to be changing something on your camera and then missing this unique moment. And especially if you're working as a professional photographer, you definitely don't want to be in a situation where you're wasting your client's time and appearing unprofessional. So this lesson is going to look at how to get the most out of your camera setting and demystify your camera. My name is William Eames and welcome back to the Professional Diploma in Photography here with Shaw Academy. Now, just a quick refresher on the housekeeping. Remember, you can join us through the website. You can also download our app as well. Hopefully, most of you have done that at this stage. You can manage your class schedule through your app and through the browser as well. You can change your class date and time, restart the course schedule if needs be. And remember, if you've ever missed a lesson, it's possible to go back over the recordings of every lesson. And indeed, you can also manage your classes through your course page. So as I mentioned, it's possible to reschedule a class if you're struggling to keep up with the current lessons as they are. You can change the class date and time to something more convenient to you. You can never miss a class as well. We send you plenty of reminders, I'm sure you've seen already, but you can also add to calendar as well to ensure that you get your own reminders. And it's possible then, if you're really kind of falling behind in later lessons, to restart the entire course schedule. So it's always possible to go back and make sure that you complete your lessons. Now, the first thing we're going to do in this lesson is we're going to break down the different components on our cameras. There's a huge amount of options, there's a huge amount of buttons, as I'm sure you're well aware of if you've ever looked at your camera. So we're going to take some time to get familiar with them. Now, for the purposes of this lesson, I am going to be using a Nikon camera as a demonstration. But all the buttons, everything that I cover in this lesson is going to be applicable to your camera as well. I strongly recommend that you have your camera manual nearby if possible, or indeed review it afterwards as well so that you get familiar with all of these buttons too. Your camera manual is a valuable resource, so do remember to use it. But we'll go through many of the functions that are universal across all different cameras. But without further ado, let's break down our camera components, starting off with the LCD screen, our liquid crystal display. Of course, it allows us to review our photographs, to change settings on the back of the camera, to go through all the menus and all the features within the camera. Many cameras have variable LCD screens now as well. That would allow us to get high, to get low, and to get those tricky angles. We have our menu button here. This will allow us to access a variety of settings, navigating through the LCD screen. So if we want to change things like turn the photographs into black and white, or perhaps we need to delete some photographs or something like that, we can do that through the menu system. We have our viewfinder. Of course, not every single camera has a viewfinder. DSLRs have viewfinders. Mirrorless cameras have EVFs, electronic viewfinders. And of course, this allows us to compose our photograph and also to be able to read the light as well through the viewfinder, something we'll speak about later on. We have a diopter on the side as well. Diopter, very important to adjust for your eyesight. So what you want to do to set the diopter correctly is to make sure that your camera is focused on something using the autofocus, or you can set the focus to infinity, which is basically focusing on the furthest object away possible on the horizon, and adjust that diopter then until everything becomes nice and sharp. Definitely check out online how to set the diopter for your own eyesight, particularly if you wear glasses. We have our playback. This allows us to review our photographs and our videos. We have an information button here, which gives us some information about our photographs. It allows us to change how we view them. It allows us to have a look at the histogram, which at an advanced level will be very, very important much later down the line. We have an adjustment dial, which allows us to navigate the menus and in some cases also to change settings as well. So sometimes, depending on the type of camera, your adjustment dial at the back of the camera will actually allow you to change some of the camera settings too. We have our delete button as well, and I say use sparingly. We have a habit of taking photographs and to very, very quickly delete them. Now, it is important as photographers to edit on the go. And when I say edit, I mean, delete pictures that we know that we're not going to use. But if you're ever on the fence about a photograph, if you're not sure about a particular photograph, don't delete it. You might feel quite differently about it at a later stage. So, be careful with that button and, maybe instead delete them off your computer afterwards. Give yourself a little bit of time because time is it's so powerful when it comes to photography. Something that you take today might mean something very, very different a couple of years down the line. And finally then we have our zoom control, so we can zoom in and out on the photographs in the playback view to make sure that they are nice and sharp. So remember now and again to zoom in on your photographs when you're looking at them on the LCD to ensure that everything is crisp and clean and clear. The last thing you want to do is to upload your photographs afterwards and find that things are a little bit soft. Turning the camera to have a look at the top. The top here we have a hot shoe. And this allows us to attach external flash units. And it's called a hot shoe because there is an electronic current flowing through it. This allows the flash to communicate with the camera. There is such thing as a cold shoe as well. It's the same shape, but it allows the external devices to be attached to the camera, but there would be no electronic current flowing through it. But a hot shoe, very, very useful, very important, in fact, really, when we want to use external flashes. Cameras have microphone now for recording sound and indeed playing back sound through video, but don't expect it to be of Dolby quality. This is just very, very basic sound. We have a pop-up flash. Not all cameras have this, but it can be very, very useful to have a little extra little bit of light, particularly in low light situations. And if you're at a party or an event or something like that, where you just want to get some nice shots to remember, a pop-up flash is very, very useful. We have our lens, of course, detachable in this case because it is a DSLR. The next lesson number 3, is all about lenses, so we'll come back to that in the next lesson. We have, of course, our on and off switch, very important to get the camera started. We have our exposure button or the shutter button. So we use this, of course, to take our photograph. But you can also press it lightly, press it halfway to focus. So we lightly press it, we focus using our shutter button as well. We have our quick record button if we want to quickly take a video. And we have exposure compensation, which we'll speak about at the end of the lesson, which allow us to purposely over or underexpose an image if we need to, which is used in our semi-automatic modes. And we have our mode dial, which we're going to be having a look extensively at through this lesson. Finally then, just rotating the camera to its side, just a couple of other options to be aware of. We have our VR switch. This is an image stabilizer. Sometimes it's also called vibration reduction, like in the case of the Nikon here. Our optical stabilization, our vibration control, it will change depending on the brand, but there'll be some form of vibration reduction. Some cameras like Sony have them built into the camera itself, so it actually has the optical stabilization built into the camera body. Okay, so do be aware of that. As I said again, remember to check out your camera's manual. We have our auto manual focus switch. You should keep this set to auto. Now, there's no correlation between the auto and manual modes, exposure modes on your camera and the auto and manual focus switch. They're interchangeable. So you can be photographing in manual mode using the auto focus, or you can be photographing in auto mode using the manual focus, and vice versa. We have our lens release here. So if we want to detach a lens and attach another lens, we press that button, we hold it in until the lens is fully removed. We can activate our pop-up flash here by simply pressing that flash button. We have FN buttons. Some cameras have multiple FN buttons. These are custom functions. We can set these as desired. And then we also have external outputs. So if we want to attach a cable release, a microphone, or if we need to connect it to our TV, audio, visual, we can do that through our external outputs. And we can attach accessories here as well. And finally, then we also have our timer cable remote release. So This is a multi-function button. Most important thing here to be aware of are the symbols. So this will allow us to do multiple exposures if we need to do high-speed photography, or we can set it that it does a timed exposure. So if we want to delay the shutter, so in other words, if we want to be in the photograph ourselves, we can set this using usually 2 seconds or 10 seconds. Or we've also, if we use an infrared remote, we can also use it by setting it with this button as well. Now, I just also want to very quickly mention about our camera's image sensors. So in the last lesson, I spoke about how our cameras capture light and it's recorded onto our image sensor. But did you know all cameras have different image sensor size? There's lots of different cameras out there, but they do all work on the exact same principles, which is light and time. So no matter what type of camera you're using, whether it's a phone, whether it's your mirrorless, or whether it's your DSLR, they all operate on the exact same principles, which is light and time. Where they differ is the size of their imaging sensors. Okay, so logically, something like a smartphone is going to have a much smaller imaging chip than compared to something like our medium format cameras here, which are the absolute top of the range, costing tens and thousands of dollars in some cases. And the larger, well, the idea is the larger the image sensor, the higher quality the image is going to be. Now, the technology has moved so fast and just keeps getting better and better and better that it's actually getting harder and harder to differentiate between the quality and what type of camera a particular photograph was taken on. Where it is going to be important is going to be when we start talking about lenses in the next lesson. But with that in mind, I want to ask you a question, okay? Because we can get hung up on image quality and what type of camera we should be using. But here's two very famous magazines. Magazine covers, okay, and I want you to tell me which one of these was taken using a smartphone. Okay, so one of these magazine covers here, we've got Time, we've got Elle. One of these was taken using a smartphone. And I want you to tell me at the end of the lesson, no cheating, don't look it up in the meantime, which one of these was taken using the smartphone. So do you think it was the Time cover, or do you think it was the Elle cover? Remember, you can interact with us via Morpheus, so if you did miss it, and I'm sure you have seen Morpheus there in the meantime. Anyway, you can interact and you can type in your questions there, and of course you can also answer them, or anything else, through support@shawacademy.com. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. Now it's time to take a closer look at our cameras and to get to breaking down our mode dial, or our mode selector, which is located on top of the camera for quick access to different camera modes. Now, not every single camera is going to have this exact type of dial. Many cameras will also have these settings located within the menu itself. Depending again on the type of camera, it's going to be change the location, maybe for size reasons or convenience reasons, etc. But most DSLRs, at least, or mirrorless cameras, will have some type of mode selector or mode dial. So let's break down each of these different symbols, starting with the most obvious, which is our automatic mode, or auto mode, which is great for just everyday photography. If you want to get out and start taking photographs straight away, not put too much thought into your technical settings, auto mode is the way to go. Let's have a look at its characteristics. So it is convenient, and that is the main thing about auto. It is a very, very convenient mode. It's pick up and go. Anybody can use it. Aims to get a correct exposure every time. Now, that doesn't mean that it always does get it correct, and that's probably most people's frustration with the automatic mode, is that it doesn't quite get things the way that we see them. So the auto mode can be a very, very frustrating mode to use, but it is a good fallback, especially if you just have to get the shot. If you're under a bit of pressure and you just need to make sure you get some type of photograph, the auto mode is very, very useful. Anybody can use it. So, if you're teaching your children photography, or you're lending your camera to somebody and they need to get some photographs, just tell them to use that auto mode and they can get some shots for sure. But you have no control over exposure at all. That's the problem with the auto mode. You have absolutely no control over your photos whatsoever. And as photographers, we really want control. And we want control because we want creative control. We want to see and capture our vision. And as I mentioned, auto mode doesn't really always get that right. It's also not great for low light photographs at all. It generally is going to try and use a pop-up flash if available. So if you're trying to do some nighttime photography, you definitely need to get away from that automatic mode. Turning the dial then to the next one, we're going to have a look at our program mode. And program mode can be a little bit confusing, but it's a stepping stone to more control. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the program mode is essentially an advanced automatic mode. It is technically a semi-auto mode. This means that some settings can be changed. A lot of photographers, and myself included, would refer to the program mode as the professional's automatic mode. Okay, so it'll always try to get the correct exposure, but if we need to change some settings, we still have that ability when we're photographing in program mode. It basically calculates the best shutter and aperture combination for any type of scene. That's our light and our time, but we can adjust one part of the exposure and the camera will adjust the other part. So if I'm photographing, say for example, and I need to change my aperture, I want to change the depth of field. Don't worry if you don't understand what that term is, we will have a look at that in a future lesson. But if I need to change the depth of field for some reason, I can change it using the program mode, and the program mode will then work out the other parts of the exposure, namely the shutter speed and the ISO, to balance and make sure the exposure is correct. Okay, so it is a very, very useful automatic mode. It's a stepping stone to full control, and as I mentioned, it's kind of like an auto mode for full professionals. It can be confusing for beginners, however, because you still need to have some understanding of terms like shutter speed, ISO, aperture, and so on. And it still doesn't really give us full control either. But as you advance with your photography, you will begin to see how useful this mode can be. Moving on then, turning the dial again, the next one to have a look at is our shutter priority, and this will allow us to control movement and allow us to control motion within our photography. And we look at shutter speed much more in detail in lesson number 5. Again, this is a semi-auto mode. In other words, this means that we can change some settings, but the camera is going to control the rest of those settings. It sometimes appears as TV, which is time value. If you're using a Canon camera, you're most likely going to see it appear as time value. This will allow you to set the shutter speed. Okay, so we just focus on shutter speed when we're using shutter priority, and this is the amount of time that the shutter opens and closes. So this is, remember, one part of our exposure triangle. This is time, and we can choose how long the exposure lasts. So this is great for doing high-speed photography or for doing long exposure photography. The camera will control the rest of the exposure, so we don't need to worry about anything else. The camera will make sure those other settings are correct, depending on the shutter speed that we set. And as I mentioned, controlling shutter speed allows motion and movement to be frozen or blurred. We use a fast shutter speed to freeze motion, or we use a slow shutter speed to blur motion. Again, we'll look at this in much more detail, but it's a good idea to experiment with this mode and experiment with shutter speeds. You can't do anything wrong, so you may as well have a go and see what it does. Your control is, however, still limited. So with all of these semi-auto modes, you are always sacrificing some controls over to the camera. And also, when you're using this mode, be careful of camera shake. Okay, so you do need to be careful that you don't set a shutter speed that's too long to handhold the camera. Otherwise, you're just going to get a photograph that's all blurry and looks out of focus, when in actual fact, it's simply camera shake. Now, moving away from shutter, we then have our other primary control for an exposure, which is our aperture. And this allows us to control the depth of field in our photograph. So aperture priority means that we just focus on adjusting the aperture within the camera. Again, semi-automatic mode sometimes appears as AV, which is aperture value. And you can set the aperture, which is the lens opening size. So as I said, another part of our exposure triangle, this controls how much light is entering the camera. We use wide apertures to let lots of light in, and for shallow depth of field, we use smaller apertures or tight apertures for deeper depth of field. We'll look at all of this in lesson number 6, so don't worry too much about it now. But the camera will control the rest of the exposure, just like we saw with our shutter priority. Just like we saw with our shutter priority. Controlling the aperture controls the depth of field in a scene, and it's a great way to learn apertures and see depth of field in action. So again, practice and experiment in this mode. Set up something in your house, I recommend, with this, like a still life, like even just photograph a piece of fruit, and experiment with those different apertures to see depth of field in action. But just remember, aperture selections are going to be limited by the lens. We'll talk about this in lesson number 3, but not all lenses are created equal, and all lenses will have different aperture ranges. So we'll talk about that in much more detail in lesson 3. It's just something to take a note of now, and they can be very difficult to understand at the start, which is why they have their own entire lesson in lesson number 6. Now, so perhaps then the one that we're all aiming to get towards is full manual control, which offers us complete control over our photography. And certainly that is what we're building up towards on this first module, is to get you photographing and fully understanding all of your choices in manual mode. We have full control. The camera does not make any decisions. We make all of the decisions over our photographs. We control the shutter speed. In other words, we control the time, we control the aperture, we control the volume of light, and we also control the ISO. We have complete control creatively and technically. So, I mean, there's a caveat to all of this because it requires knowledge to use. To get the most out of it, we need to understand all of these different terms: shutter speed, aperture, ISO. We also need to understand how to focus correctly. We also need to know how to set our white balance. So many things that we're going to cover throughout the rest of these lessons. And by the time we get to fully manual mode, you'll be surprised at, how easy it all is to put together. And it is indeed the most satisfying mode to use. When we get results using fully manual mode, we can really kind of say to ourselves, well, I have mastered my camera. Now, there are some other modes to be aware of as well. So many cameras will have these extra kind of auto modes available to them, like macro, sports, portrait. These are just preset modes for a variety of different scenarios, where basically the camera will try to just set the aperture and the shutter speed to what it thinks are the best settings for these types of situation. Okay, they sometimes get it right, but in all honesty, I think you're better off sticking with things like your program, your shutter priority, your aperture priority, and your fully manual mode. Some cameras will also have these kind of creative auto effects, which will kind of add different kind of styles to your images, like black and white, which is cool, but then there's like other kind of art styles and that. Not very, very useful in my opinion. This is something you're going to want to be able to do afterwards in post-production yourself. Again, a little bit more advanced, something we'll talk about later on. You might also find as well, you've got these custom options as well, C1, C2, or U1, U2, and so on. And these will allow you to kind of, these are presets that you can choose the settings that you want to use. So, you know, for example, if you're a wedding photographer and you have a particular way of photographing, you can maybe set some functions to your user one option so that you can just quickly change the dial to that, instead of having to kind of faff about and go through all of the settings within your camera. Now, finally, I just want to also mention as well about exposure compensation. So this is a very, very useful button available on nearly every single camera. And basically, exposure compensation will allow us to adjust the exposure when we're photographing in semi-automatic modes. So in aperture priority, shutter priority, program mode. If the camera happens to get it slightly wrong, we can increase or decrease the exposure using exposure compensation. How it works is we simply press this plus and minus button, and we can then just rotate our control dial, and we will see the exposure getting brighter or getting darker. Some cameras as well have this very, very convenient, simple EV exposure here, where you can just go -1, -2, or +1 or +2, depending on how much light or how much darkness you want to add to an image. And these are all things we're going to be speaking about at a later stage. But for now, it's important to be aware of it, that it is still possible to adjust exposure in our semi-automatic modes if needs be. We do not use it in fully manual mode. We don't need to use it in fully manual mode because we make all of those adjustments ourselves. Now, so that is the end of the lesson. Let's have a quick look at what is coming up in the next lesson. We're going to talk all about lenses. First of all, having a look at the different lens components, so how our lenses are actually made and their angle of view. And then we'll also talk about different types of lenses. So we'll have a look at the huge family of lenses that's available to us, and also the difference between zoom lenses and prime lenses. Now, a little bit earlier on in the lesson, I asked you which one of these was taken with a smartphone, and I played a little bit of a trick on you, because it's actually both. Both of these images were photographed using a smartphone. Okay, so perhaps you could see that a little bit more on the image on the left here of Oprah Winfrey. For me, I think the quality just isn't kind of maybe up to scratch there as compared to a professional camera, but that L cover is almost impossible to tell. So I believe both of these were taken using iPhones, but incredible photograph there, especially the L one, and you know, something we're going to talk about later on, all about the light, the quality of the light in that photograph really, really makes it. So it just kind of goes to show you, it doesn't matter what type of camera you're using, it's still capable of taking a fantastic photograph. With that in mind, I'd like you to tell us what camera you are currently using, but post a photograph on it as well, from it, onto facebook.com/Shaw Academy. So facebook.com/Shaw Academy, or indeed you can email us in at support@shawacademy.com. So that is the end of this lesson number 2. I'll see you all back here again very, very soon for lesson number 3. Well done on completing your first week on the Professional Diploma